He asked me a question no guardsman had ever asked me, and he asked it at the wrong window. The tally house keeps 3 windows open to the yard. The first is for pensions, the second for household accounts, the third for the wharf duties, and I was the second clerk at the second window, which meant that for 11 years I had listened to cooks argue about the price of salt. On a wet Thursday in the month of the late rains, a man in a guardsman's greatcoat stepped out of the queue, set his gloved hands on my sill and said, "Madam, how much does 100,000 crowns weigh?" Rain ran off the peak of his cap and made a small clean line down the collar of that coat. He was not young. There was gray in the stubble on his jaw, and the skin around his eyes had the permanent squint of a man who has spent 20 years looking at the middle distance in all weathers. His boots had been polished that morning and ruined by the yard, and he did not seem to mind. "That is not a household account," I said. "No, madam." "Then you want the third window." The third window would ask me why. I should have sent him away. In the kingdom of Eldermore there is a right and proper channel for every question, and a clerk who answers outside her channel is a clerk who ends the year at the wharf counting barrels of pitch. But it was raining, and the queue had thinned, and there was something in the flat, patient way he asked it, as though he had been carrying the question for weeks and had finally found a place to set it down. So I took a scrap of tally paper and did what clerks do. "A silver crown is struck 20 to the pound," I said. "So 100,000 crowns is 5,000 pounds of silver, 2.5 tons. That is more than a single wagon can carry over cobbles without the axle complaining, and a great deal more than a horse will forgive you for." He did not write it down. He stood there and let the numbers settle into him the way a man lets cold water settle into his boots. "And in bullion," he said. "In bullion, you would need a strong box and a strong back. Gold is heavier for its size and lighter for its worth. 100,000 crowns in gold bar is perhaps 130 pounds, 2 men and a plank." 130 pounds, he repeated. "You could carry it in a sack of candles," I said, "if the sack were honest." I meant it as a joke. He looked at me for a long moment, and I understood, with the small cold drop in the stomach that comes before you have consciously understood anything at all, that I had said the thing he had come to hear. "Thank you, madam," said Sergeant Corwin Rooke of the King's Household Guard, and he touched the peak of his cap, and he went back out into the rain. I have to begin at the window, because that is where the thread begins, and because for the rest of my life I have measured my own courage against a man who asked one honest question at the wrong window and then did not let go of it. My name is Wren Halloway. At the time I am describing I was 34 years old, unmarried, and the second clerk of the Tally House of Harrowgate, which is to say I was the person who checked whether the palace had actually received the 400 ells of gray linen it had paid for. It is unglamorous work. It is also, if you do it long enough, a kind of second sight. You learn the shape of an honest account, and when a dishonest one comes across your desk it does not announce itself with a shout. It simply sits there, wrong in some way you cannot name, and it hums. By the time Sergeant Rooke came to my window, a great deal in the accounts of the Royal House of Harrowgate had been humming for 2 years, and nobody at all had been listening. The Coalgate is the palace's 4th gate and its least loved. The State Gate faces the avenue and the cameras. The Garden Gate faces the park. The Mews Gate takes the horses. The Coalgate faces a lane behind the brewhouse and takes everything the palace would rather not be seen taking: the coal, the fish, the lime, the ash, the sacks of onions. It is a working gate, and the household guards stand it in full ceremonial order anyway, because the rule in Eldermore is that a man in the red tunic stands the same at the Coalgate as he stands at the State Gate, or he does not stand at all. Corwin Rooke had stood the Coalgate for 6 years. 6 years is a long time to be still in one place. Most men are rotated. Most men want to be. Rooke had asked to stay, and there was talk about that. the way there is always talk that he had been passed over, that he had no ambition. None of it was true, and I did not learn the truth of it until much later. What matters here is the arithmetic of standing still. A man on that gate stands 2 hours on, 4 off, from the 5th hour of the morning to the 9th of the evening. In 6 years, Rooke had watched something in the order of 40,000 wagons come through the Coalgate arch and turn left into the service yard. He knew the sound of a coal wagon on the cobbles and the lighter chatter of a wagon of empty crates. He knew that a full load of sea coal cuts a rut in the wet lane an inch deep, and that the near horse always takes the strain on the turn. He knew, without being told and without ever having been asked, what the palace weighed. And in the spring of that year, a wagon began coming through the Coalgate that weighed the wrong amount. He told me all of this later, in a corridor of the tally house at an hour when neither of us had any business being there, and he told it in the flat, exact, unhurried way that guardsmen tell things. No color, no flourish. The facts laid out like kit on a bed for inspection. The wagon belonged to a carrier called Thrace and Sons, wharfingers. It came on the last night of every quarter between the 3rd and the 4th hour of the morning, which is the hour when the world is at its stupidest. It carried, according to the gate book, salt, wax candles, and gray linen for the almonry of the consort's hand. The almonry of the consort's hand was the charitable office of Her Majesty the Queen Consort Morwenna. It dispersed the crown's relief, the flood money for the Rel Valley, the pensions of the old soldiers of the realm, the houses of ease in the river wards, the winter coal for the poor of the capital. It occupied the west range of the palace, an old gray building with an undercroft, and it had its own porter, its own clerks, and its own seal. Its accounts were rendered once a year to the crown, and by ancient custom they were rendered as a single figure, because the alms of the consort are a gift of the heart and not a matter for the tally house. I have thought about that custom a great deal since. Every great theft in the history of the world has been carried out inside a custom that nobody wanted to be the first to question. Salt and candles, Rooke said to me. 2.5 tons of it every quarter night. That is a great deal of candles. That is what I said to the carter. And he said the almonry burns a great many candles. Rooke was quiet a moment. Somewhere below us in the tally house, a shutter was banging in the wind, and nobody was getting up to fix it. Madam, I have watched that wagon come in through my arch 11 times. It rides low. The ruts it cuts are the ruts of coal, not linen. The near horse lathers on a flat turn in cold weather. The bed of that wagon is loaded so that the weight sits over the axle and not over the tail, which is how you load iron or stone or coin. Because if you load candles that way, you are a fool, and if you load anything heavy any other way, you break the wagon. That is a great deal to see from a gate. There is nothing else to see from a gate, he said. That is what a gate is. And then he said the sentence I have never been able to get out of my head, the one I have repeated to every young clerk I have ever trained. And then it goes out again empty at the 6th hour, and the ruts are gone. Whatever weighs 2.5 tons goes in through my arch every quarter and never comes out. So either the almonry is eating it, madam, or it is still in there. I want to be honest about what I did next, because I did not do the brave thing. I did the careful thing. I went and looked at the accounts. The almonry's own books were closed to me. That was the custom, the single figure, the gift of the heart. But the almonry did not exist in a vacuum. It bought from the same wharves as everybody else. It hired from the same guilds. It paid tolls, and the tolls were entered in the tables of the river clerks. And the river clerks' tables came to my window at the end of every quarter for reconciliation, and no one in the history of Eldermore had ever read them, because they were 400 pages of gray nothing, and their whole purpose was to be filed. I read them. It took me 9 nights. I sat in the tally house with a lamp and a wet cloth for my eyes, and I read every entry of every barge and every wagon that had paid a toll to the crown on behalf of the almonry of the consort's hand for 2 years. Here is what the gray nothing said. The almonry had, in those 2 years, paid out just under 9 million crowns. That figure alone was not a crime. The Rel Valley floods had been the worst in 40 years. 11 villages had gone under the brown water in a single night. The relief had been voted by the king's own hand. 9 million crowns was a plausible, even a generous, sum for the rebuilding of 11 villages and the pensioning of their dead men's widows. But the money had gone to 3 names. Thrace and Sons, wharfingers who carried. The Marrow Company who supplied. Halbeck Stone who built. 3 names and nothing else. No Masons' Guild. No timber merchants. No carters of the Rel Valley itself, not one, though the Rel Valley is full of carters and every one of them would have crawled on his knees for crown work in a year like that. No grain factors. No smiths. 3 names took 9 million crowns for the rebuilding of 11 villages, and the receipts were rendered in a hand so neat and so regular that it made my teeth ache. I laid the 3 seals side by side on my desk at 2 in the morning, and I looked at them for a long time. They were 3 different seals. Thrace's was a fish, Marrow's was a wheatchief, Halbeck's was a mason square. 3 different devices, 3 different wax colors, 3 different companies with 3 different addresses in 3 different wards of the capital. And on every single one of them, the wax had been pressed with the same thumb. You will think that is a fancy. It is not. Sealing wax takes a thumbprint the way wet sand takes a boot, and a clerk who has spent 11 years staring at wax knows a thumb with a scar across the ball of it, a scar shaped like a fishhook, when she has seen it 400 times. I sat back in my chair. The lamp guttered, and in the great, cold, sleeping bulk of the palace above me, somewhere behind a wall, 2.5 tons of something that was not candles was sitting in the dark, waiting. We met the next evening, in the lee of the brewhouse, in the rain, because that was the only place in Harrowgate where 2 people could talk without being seen, and neither of us was yet frightened enough to think about being heard. I told him about the 3 names. He listened the way he did everything, without moving. 9 million crowns, he said when I had finished. 9 million, or near it. It is not exact yet. It will not be exact until somebody with the king's warrant opens the almonry's own books, and nobody will do that, because the almonry's books are the consort's private charity, and to ask for them is to call the Queen Consort a thief. Is she one? I remember the rain on the brewhouse roof. I remember that I looked over both my shoulders before I answered, and that I was ashamed of it even as I did it. The warrants that pay Thrace and Marrow and Halbeck are countersigned, I said. The controller of the almonry signs them. That is Lord Cassius. Her son. Her son. And above the controller's hand there is a seal, and the seal is hers, and it is on every warrant, and I have not found 1 single crown of that 9 million that reached the Rel Valley. Rooke turned his head then and looked at me directly for the first time, and I saw something move behind his face, quick, and buried at once, the way a big fish shows for half a second in a dark river. Not one, he said. Not one. I have the toll tables of every road into the valley. In 2 years nothing has gone up those roads but a mail coach and a peddler. There are no wagons of stone. There are no wagons of timber. The 11 villages of the Rel Valley have not been rebuilt, Sergeant. They have not been begun. He was quiet for a long time. I know, he said at last. You know. I am from Ashenford, said Corwin Rooke. It is the 9th of the 11. My sister writes to me twice a year. She has been living in her own hayloft since the water came, with her husband and his mother, and last winter they burned the door of the house for warmth because the house had no roof to keep the door out of the rain. He said this without any change of tone at all, which was somehow much worse than if he had wept. In the spring she wrote that the crown's relief had come at last. A man from the almonry rode down with a letter. The letter said that the Rel Valley's restoration was proceeding to plan, and that the Crown thanked them for their patience. The rain came down on the brewhouse roof. "I did not start counting wagons because of my sister," he said. "I want that on the record, madam, whatever record there turns out to be. I started counting wagons because a wagon of candles rides high and that one rode low, and it is my gate, and a thing that is wrong on my gate is my business. I did not know where the money went until you told me tonight." He looked out at the black rain. "But I know now. There is a thing that happens to a certain kind of man at a certain moment, and I watched it happen to him in the rain behind a brewhouse." He did not become angry, he became still. He had been still before in the way that all guardsmen are still, a trained, professional stillness, the stillness of a man doing his 8 hours. What came over him that night was different in kind. It was the stillness of a thing that has been set, like a stone in a wall or a nail driven home. Everything in him that could be moved had been moved already, and what was left was not going anywhere. "What do you need?" I said. "I need to know where it is," he said. "You can count what a thief takes. It does not matter. A count is a piece of paper, and a piece of paper can be burned, and every man in that hall will say the numbers were mistaken, and they will believe it because they will want to. It has to be asterisk found asterisk." He put on his gloves, one and then the other, and settled his cap. 9 million crowns is a great deal of weight, madam. Weight has to be somewhere. Find me a wall with nothing behind it, and I will show the king what nothing weighs." He went back to the gate. And I went back to my window, and for 11 days I did nothing at all, because I was afraid. And I am setting that down plainly, because everything that follows was bought with his courage and not with mine, and I have no wish to steal a share of it at this late hour. Then, on the 12th day, the controller of the almonry came down to the tally house in person and asked, very pleasantly, and in front of everybody, which of the clerks had been reading the river clerk's toll tables. Lord Cassius was a handsome man in the way that a well-made lock is handsome. Everything about him fitted. He came into the long room of the tally house with 2 secretaries and a smile, his hat under his arm, and he said it as though it were the pleasantest errand in the world. "Someone has been at the toll tables," he said. "It is very good of them. I have been meaning to have them properly kept for years. Nobody reads them, you know, they are a scandal. Whoever it is has done the Crown a service, and I should like to thank them personally." 20 clerks bent over their work. The scratch of 20 pens went on without a stutter, which is the closest thing to loyalty you will find in a room of civil servants. I looked up and said, "That would be me, my lord." I do not know why. It was not courage. I think it was that I had watched a man in a wet greatcoat stand in the rain and say it is my gate, and I found I could not sit at my own desk and pretend it was not my ledger. Cassius turned to me, and I watched his eyes do a thing I have seen since in men at the gaming tables, a fast, cold flick of calculation, gone before it could be named. "Halloway, isn't it?" he said, "second clerk." "Yes, my lord." "Marvelous. And what did you find in them, Halloway?" "Tolls, my lord." "Tolls?" The smile stayed exactly where it was. "Anything interesting about the tolls?" "They are very badly kept," I said, "as you say." He looked at me for 3 full seconds. Then he laughed and told me I was a treasure, and said that the almonry would be sure to remember the tally house at midwinter, and he went out with his secretaries, and the room breathed. That evening a runner came from the Lord Steward's office with a letter. It was very polite. In view of the exceptional pressure of work at the river wharves, the second clerk of the tally house was to be transferred, with immediate effect and no loss of pay, to the duty of the wharf tally at Cold Harbor, 3 miles downriver. And in view of the imminent annual audit, the reconciliation ledgers of the past 2 years, the river clerk's toll tables among them, were to be sealed in the strong-box of the Lord Steward's office and touched by no one. 11 days I had been afraid. It took Cassius 11 hours to move me out of the building. Cold Harbor is a good place to bury a clerk. The tide comes into the counting shed twice a month, and the wharf master is a decent man with no curiosity at all. I counted barrels of pitch. I counted hides. I counted 4,000 crates of dried fish, and every evening I walked the 3 miles back into the city in the dark because I could not sleep. And every third evening, at the top of the water stair where the lamp is broken, a man in a greatcoat would be leaning on the rail as though he had nothing else in the world to do. That is how the rest of it was built. Not in a great chamber, not in a rush of discovery. In pieces, over 5 weeks, by a wharf clerk who smelled of fish and a sergeant who had 4 hours off between 2 hours on. He began, as he did everything, with what he could measure. "The almonry Undercroft," he said on the first of those evenings. "Have you been in it?" "Once, years ago. It is a store barrels of oil sacks the winter coal." "How many bays?" "Bays?" "Pillars," he said. "Vaulted Undercrofts run in bays. 2 rows of pillars, arches between them. How many?" I had no idea. Nobody has any idea. "You do not count the pillars in a cellar." 12, he said. "There are 12 bays. I have been down twice on lawful errands, once with the coal and once with a barrel of lamp oil, and I have counted them twice. 12 bays. Each bay, from center of pillar to center of pillar, is a shade over 2 of my paces, and my pace is 1.5 yards, because they measured it out of me at the depot in my first year, and it has not changed." "Sergeant, 12 bays is 25 paces from the stair to the end wall," he said. "I have walked it. 25 twice, and the second time I did it slowly with my hand on the wall, so that no one would think I was doing anything but looking for a lamp." He turned around on the water stair and looked at me, and the river light came off the water and up onto his face. "The outside of that building," he said, "is 34 paces. I have paced it in the lane at 4 in the morning 3 times. There is a foot of stone in each end wall which I have measured at the door, so call it 32 inside. 25 and 32. I did the sum before he finished saying it. Any clerk would have. 7 paces, I said. 7 paces, said Corwin Rooke. 10.5 yards of the Royal House of Harrowgate that are not in the cellar and are not outside the building. 7 paces of nothing, madam, at the dark end, behind the end wall of the Undercroft, under the almonry, where the plans of this palace say there is solid earth. The tide slapped at the stones below us. Plans can be wrong, I said. My voice did not sound like my own. Plans are never wrong, he said. Plans are changed. I went to the Office of Works and asked for the palace plan of the West Range, and they gave it to me quite happily, because I'm a sergeant of the guard, and I told them I was checking the fire drills, which was true, because I am. And the plan of the West Range is dated in the year of the last renovation, 31 years ago, and it is a beautiful clean drawing, and it shows 12 bays and solid ground beyond. Then, and it has been redrawn, he said. Not badly. Somebody good did it. But the ink of the end wall is not the ink of the other walls, madam, and when you hold it up to a window the paper has been scraped. When men tell this story now, they tell it as though a guardsman kicked down a door. That is not what happened. What happened was slower and harder, and I think braver. He stood his gate. 2 hours on, 4 off, in the rain and out of it, at a service gate behind a brewhouse, in full ceremonial order, while the men who were robbing his kingdom drove past his shoulder at 3 in the morning with their hats pulled down. He did not challenge them. He did not stop a single wagon. He could have a sergeant of the household guard may stop and search any vehicle at his gate, and if he had, he would have found salt and candles on the top of the load, and a smiling carter with a warrant under the consort's seal, and he would have been broken to private by the end of the week, and the wagon would simply have come in through the Mews gate instead. So he stood and he watched, and he built the thing up out of nothing, the way a mason builds a wall. He learned that the almonry's night porter, an old soldier named Holly's Peck, was always sent for supper on the quarter nights. Always. On the last night of the quarter, at the 3rd hour, the almonry's understeward would come down and tell Peck to go and get himself something hot, and Peck would go and be gone an hour and come back to a locked undercroft. He learned that on the morning after every quarter night, the almonry took delivery of a load of quicklime for the drains, and that the drains of the West Range had been relayed in Rooke's 2nd year and had never given a moment's trouble since. He learned that Thrace and Sons, wharfingers, kept no wharf. And he learned about the frost. It was the first hard frost of the autumn, and he came up the water stair that evening walking faster than usual, which for Rooke was a sprint. "Madam, this morning the whole of the West Range was white." It was white everywhere. "The whole of the West Range," he said, "except a strip 3 feet wide and 7 paces long, running along the foot of the almonry wall at the dark end in the lane where the frost had gone, melted clean off the cobbles. And there is no drain there, and no kitchen behind that wall, and no flue in it, because I have been up on the roof of the brew house with a glass, and there is no flue in that end of the range at all." "Then what is under the cobbles?" "Warm air," he said. "Warm air rises, and it comes up through the joints of a cobble lane, and it melts the frost, and it means that under that lane there is a room, and in that room there is a stove or a lamp or a man." He took his cap off, which he almost never did, and turned it in his hands. "There is a chamber under the almonry, 7 paces long, that is not on the plan, and somebody keeps it dry. The river went by under us." "Sergeant," I said, "who do you take this to?" He put his cap back on. "I have already taken it," he said, "to my captain yesterday." Captain Iverdane was not a bad man. I have thought about it for years, and I keep arriving at the same place. He was not a bad man, and he did the worst thing in this whole story, and both of those are true at once. He was a career officer, 48, a good record, a wife in poor health, and a pension 11 years away. He had known Rooke for a decade, and he liked him. He listened to the whole thing, the ruts, the bays, the paces, the scraped plan, the frost, standing at the window of his office with his back to the room, and when Rooke had finished he was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "Sergeant, the almonry is not ours." "Sir?" "It is not ours. It is the consort's household. It is not the king's household. We stand the gate. We do not audit the alms. If you go into that cellar, you go into the private charity of the Queen Consort of Eldermore, on the strength of some cobblestones, and account of your own feet, and there is not a man in this realm who will thank you for it. Sir, there is 9,000,000 crowns. "There is nothing," said Dane, and he turned around, and Rooke told me later that the man's face was gray. "There is nothing, Sergeant, until somebody with more than a sergeant's word opens a wall, and nobody will open that wall because the wall belongs to her. Do you understand what you are asking me to do? You are asking me to write a report with my name on it accusing the wife of the king of theft. I have 30 years. I have a wife who cannot climb the stairs. And you are a good soldier, and I am telling you this once, as your friend and not as your officer. Let it go." Rooke stood at attention in the middle of the office for a moment. Then he said, "No, sir." Just that. He told me afterwards that he had not planned to say it, and that it came out of him the way a cough comes out, and that as soon as it was said he understood he had spent something he could not get back. Dane sat down at his desk. He looked at his hands. "Then you are on your own," he said, "and God help you, because I cannot." The old porter came to us in the 3rd week, and he came because Rooke went to him and did not ask him for anything. Holly's Peck was 71, and had served 22 years in the line before his knees gave out. The almonry had made him a night porter, with a room off the stair and a pension of 40 crowns a year, and he had a photograph of his old company on the wall and a tin box of medals he did not wear. Rooke sat with him in the porter's room on 3 separate evenings and talked about the depot, and the drill sergeants they had both hated, and a march over the Belsmore in a snowstorm in a year before I was born. On the third evening Peck said, without being asked, "You want to know about the Quarternights?" "I want to know nothing you do not want to tell me," said Rooke. "They send me for my supper." "I know." The old man got up slowly, the way a man gets up when his knees are gone, and he went to a shelf and took down a small book with a canvas cover, the sort of book they issue to a corporal to keep his section's kit list in. 22 years in the line," he said. "Do you know what they beat into you in 22 years? Write it down. Every man, every night, every door. They beat it into me so hard that I have never in my life been able to stop." He put the book on the table. "I have kept a night book in this room for 9 years. Every soul who comes through that door and the hour and what they carried. I have never shown it to a living person. Nobody has ever asked me for it. Nobody has ever once thought that the old man on the stool could write." Rooke looked at the book and did not touch it. "Mr. Peck," he said, "if I take that they will break you." "Sergeant," said Hollis Peck, "I am 71. My wife is dead. My pension is 40 crowns a year from a charity that has, if you are right, robbed the widows of 11 villages." He pushed the book an inch across the table. "What in the name of the king do you imagine they can take from me?" I read the night book on the wharf, in the counting shed at Cold Harbor, with the tide coming in under the boards and a stub of candle in a fish crate. It was written in pencil by a man with a shaking grip, and it will be studied in the Tally House for 100 years. Quarternight, 3rd hour. Understeward Falk sends me for supper. Return at 4th hour in 20 minutes. Undercroft door locked. It is not usually locked. A smell of lamp oil on the stair. Cobbles in the lane wet, no rain. 9 years of that. 36 quarternights. And Peck, being Peck, had written down what he saw on his way out as well as on his way in, and what he had seen, every time without fail for 2 years, was a light burning in the little window at the dark end of the Almonry Range. There is no room at the dark end of the Almonry Range. The last piece was the house of Varon, and it was the piece I could get, because it was the piece that was made of paper. A counting house cannot be invisible. It must, by the law of Eldermore, register a bond with the Crown. The bond must state the trade it does. And the bonds are lodged, nobody will be surprised by this, with a clerk. My ledgers were sealed in the Lord Steward's strongbox, but bonds are not ledgers, and the bond book of the counting houses sits on a lectern in the public hall of the Exchange where any citizen may read it. There are days when I think the whole rotten scheme came down, because Lord Cassius had never once in his life had to look up anything for himself. The House of Varon's bond declared its trade as the receipt of coin, the assay and refining thereof, and the striking and warranting of bullion bars to the standard of the Crown. They took coin, they melted it, they gave you gold. And every bar that came out of their furnace was stamped, by law and by their own proud custom, with a maker's mark, a V within a circle, and a serial filed into the shoulder, and the serial was entered in the Varon day book against the name of the man who brought the coin in. 9 million crowns in silver is 450 tons. You cannot hide 450 tons under a cellar. You cannot hide it under a city. 9 million crowns in Varon bullion is a little under 6 tons of gold, a room's worth. 7 paces long, 3 wide, stacked to a man's shoulder. 2.5 tons a quarter, in a wagon of salt and candles. "That is it," Rooke said when I told him, and for the first and only time in the whole business I heard something like triumph in his voice, and it frightened me more than anything else had, because triumph is a thing that makes men move too soon. "That is the whole of it, madam. They take the Crown's relief in warrants. The warrants pay Thrace and Marrow and Halbeck, who are one man with a scarred thumb. Thrace and Marrow and Halbeck carry the coin to Varon. Varon melts the realm's money into gold, and stamps it with a V and a number. And Thrace and Sons, wharfingers who have no wharf, drive it back in through my gate at the 3rd hour of the quarternight in a sack of candles, and put it in a room that is not on the plan of the palace, under the floor of a charity. Under the floor of a charity, I repeated. Why not a country house? Why not a bank in another kingdom? Why keep it here? He looked at me as though I had asked, why water runs downhill. Because it is the safest place in the world, he said. No magistrate in Eldermore can search the Royal House of Harrowgate. No sheriff, no bailiff, no revenue man. There is exactly one warrant on this earth that opens a door inside these walls, and that is the king's, and the king will not sign a warrant to search his own wife's charity on the word of a wharf clerk and a sergeant of the Coalgate. He said it without bitterness, as a fact, the way he had said that a crown weighs 1/20 of a pound. They have not hidden it from the law, madam. They have hidden it behind the law. It is the cleverest thing I have ever seen, and I have been thinking about it for 11 weeks. Then how? Somebody has to make the king look, said Rooke. He wrote it out that week. 9 pages in a guardsman's hand, on paper he bought himself. No accusations, no adjectives, no theories, a list of things a man had seen from a gate, with dates and hours. 11 wagons, the ruts, the load over the axle, 25 paces inside, 34 outside, 7 unaccounted, the frost line, the scraped plan in the office of works, 36 quarternights in a porter's book, 3 companies with 1 thumb, a counting house that turned silver into stamped gold, 9 million crowns voted for 11 drowned villages that have not received a barrow of gravel. And at the end, 1 sentence. I request that the wall at the dark end of the almonry undercroft be opened in the presence of an officer of the crown. He signed it. He put his number under his name. And because Captain Dane would not carry it, and the chain of command above Dane ran through the master of the household, who dined twice a week with Lord Cassius, he did the only thing left to a man who has no channel. On the morning of the Feast of the Founding, when the whole house walks in procession from the chapel to the State Hall, he stepped out of the guard of honor in the West Cloister, went to one knee before the king's sister, and put the papers into the hands of Her Royal Highness the Princess Adela. It broke every regulation in the book. He knew it when he did it. He told me afterwards that he had chosen Adela because, in 6 years of standing at gates, he had watched her come and go 300 times, and she was the only member of that house who had ever once looked at the man on the gate and seen a man. She took the papers. She did not speak. She put them under her arm and walked on with the procession, and the whole cloister had seen it, and Lord Cassius, 4 places behind her, had seen it too. They took Rooke 11 days later. I have gone over those 11 days more times than I can count. They were not idle. They were building. What they did was not hasty. It was designed by somebody clever, and it was designed to do 2 jobs at once, to destroy the man, and to explain in advance why a sergeant of the Coalgate had been telling wild stories about money. The almonry of the consort's hand kept an alms box at its street door. It was an old oak thing with an iron band, and the poor of the river wards put their pennies in it, which was a joke that nobody at the almonry seemed to find funny, and once a month it was opened and counted. On the 11th day it was found broken open and empty, and its lock lying on the step. And in the kit locker of Sergeant Corwin Rooke, at the Coalgate guardhouse, wrapped in an oiled rag and pushed to the back behind his blacking and his spare gloves, they found a leather purse containing 240 crowns. The arrest was done properly. I will give them that, and it cost me something to write it. 2 provost sergeants came to the gate at the change of the watch, and they were not rough with him, and one of them was a man Rooke had trained. He gave up his belt and his bayonet and his rifle without a word, and he walked out through his own arch between them, and the carter who was waiting there with a load of cabbages took off his cap, which nobody had told him to do. They put him in the provost's cells under the mews. The charge was theft of alms from the almonry of the consort's hand, an offense which, for a serving man of the household guard, carried dismissal with disgrace, the forfeiture of his pension, and 7 years. The palace put it about gently, sadly, The way such things are put about, that the poor man had got himself into debt, and had taken the money, and had then invented a great tale about a treasure under the almonry to muddy the water, that he had accosted the princess in a cloister with 9 pages of nonsense about frost and paces, that it was very sad, and that he had been a good soldier once, and that Her Majesty the Queen Consort had asked in her mercy that the matter be dealt with quietly. It was perfect. It was, I have to admit, perfect. Every single thing he had done to expose them had been turned inside out and made into the evidence of his own madness. The 9 pages became his defense, and his defense made him ridiculous. And I sat in a fish shed at Cold Harbor with a candle, and I read the arrest notice that the wharf master had pinned to the board, and I saw the one thing they had got wrong. 240 crowns. I read it 4 times. Then I put on my coat and I walked 3 miles into the city in the dark, and I hammered on a door. Here is what a clerk knows. An alms box at a street door in the river wards, opened once a month, is a box of pennies. It is halfpence and farthings and worn quarter-crowns with the king's nose rubbed off them. It is the money of laundresses and porters and men who unload fish. In 11 years, I had passed the almonry's alms returns across my desk 40 times, and the average take of that box was between 6 and 9 crowns a month, and it came in as a bag of coppers so filthy that the tally house kept a separate cloth for handling it. 240 crowns is not what is in that box. It would be the takings of 2.5 years, and the box was emptied monthly, and the returns were asterisk filed. And anyone with the last 4 years of those returns in front of them could have proved in 90 seconds that the sum they claimed he had stolen had never existed. They had not looked it up. That is the crack. The men who ran a 2-year, 9 million crown conspiracy through 3 shell companies, a bullion house, and a vault that was not on the plan of the palace could not be troubled to find out how much money was actually in the box they said he robbed. They had needed a figure. Somebody had said make it a serious sum, and somebody had gone to the nearest source of coin they had and counted out 240 crowns and put it in a purse. The nearest source of coin they had. I stood in the street in the dark outside the house of the only person in the kingdom of Eldermore I could still think of to hammer at, and the tide of it came over me, and I had to hold on to the railing. They had paid for the frame out of the vault. The door opened. Captain Ivor Dane stood in it in his shirt-sleeves with a lamp, and he looked at me the way a man looks at the thing he has been dreading for 11 weeks. "You are the clerk," he said. "I am the clerk." "He is in the cells. There is nothing." "Captain," I said, "where are the coins?" He blinked. "The coins they found in his locker, 240 crowns. Where are they now?" "In the provost's evidence chest," he said slowly. "Sealed. They will be produced at the court-martial as an exhibit." "Have you looked at them?" "Madam, they are asterisk crowns." "Have you looked at them?" I said, and I heard my own voice go up, out there in the street in the middle of the night at a captain of the household guard. Because I have been 11 years in the tally house, and I will tell you what alms money looks like. It is black. It is worn smooth. Half of it is copper, and I will bet you your pension, Captain, I will bet you your pension and your wife's stairs and your 30 years, that when you open that chest, every single one of those 240 crowns will be silver, and new and bright, and struck within the year. Dane stood in his doorway, with the lamp shaking very slightly in his hand. "And if they are," he said. "Then they did not come out of a poor box," I said. "They came out of a hoard. And there is only one hoard in this city big enough that nobody troubled to count what they took from it. And it is under the floor of the almonry of the consort's hand, 7 paces long, behind a wall that a sergeant of your regiment has been begging you to open since the first hard frost of the autumn." They opened the evidence chest at 6 the next morning, in the provost's office under the mews, with the provost marshal himself standing over it, because Dane had gone straight from his door to wake the man and had not sat down since. I was allowed to be present as the Crown's clerk. It was the last hour I ever spent as a servant of the Crown, and I would not trade it for a peerage. The seal on the purse was intact. The provost marshal cut it and turned the purse out onto a square of green baize, and 240 crowns went across it in a long, bright hiss. Bright, everyone. Not a copper among them. Not a worn quarter crown, not a blackened penny, not one coin that had ever been through the hands of a laundress in the river wards. 240 pieces of new silver, the mill on the edges still sharp enough to catch a thumbnail, lying there in the lamplight looking exactly like what they were, which was money that had never been spent. Dane let out a breath that had been 11 weeks coming. "New," he said. "Look closer," I said. Because there was something else. I had seen it as they fell. I picked one up and held it to the lamp and turned it, and my hands were steady, which surprised me, and I have never been so certain of anything in my life. Under the king's chin, where on an ordinary crown there is nothing but a smooth field of silver, there was a mark the size of a grain of barley. 3 little waves. "Provost Marshal," I said, "do you know what this is?" He did not. "In the spring of the flood," I said, "the king ordered 9 million crowns for the relief of the Rel Valley, and because he is a careful man, and because it is a very great deal of money to send into a broken country, he ordered that it be struck as a special issue at the Royal Mint and marked so that the crown could follow it. 3 waves under the chin. The Rel issue. It was struck for one purpose and one place, and by the king's own warrant it was to be paid out in the 11 villages of the Rel Valley and nowhere else in this kingdom." I set the coin down in the middle of the baize. "There are 240 of them in this room," I said, 300 miles from where they are lawfully permitted to be, in the locker of a man who has been in the Rel Valley once in his life, at the age of 11 when he left it. Gentlemen, the flood money never went to the flood. It is asterisk here, and somebody dipped into it last week to buy 240 crowns worth of a sergeant's ruin, and did not think, not for one single second, to look at what was on the coins. For about 4 days, we thought we had won. That is the part that still turns in me like a splinter. The provost marshal was an honest man. He sealed 20 of the coins in a box under 3 signatures, his, Dane's, and mine, and lodged it with the master of the mint, who confirmed in writing within the day that they were of the Rel issue, and that by the king's warrant no coin of that issue had any lawful business within 100 miles of Harrowgate. Dane wrote his report. It was 3 pages, and it was the bravest thing that tired, frightened, decent man ever did, and it had his name on it, and it went up the chain of command the way he had spent 30 years learning to send things, through the master of the household. And the master of the household read it and thanked him, and made 3 replies. To the coins, he replied that the almonry had administered the Rel relief, and that it was therefore in no way surprising that coin of the Rel issue should be found within the almonry's own building. Indeed, it would be surprising if it were not, and that a quantity of it had doubtless been left in the alms box as change by returning officers of the charity, and that this was regrettable bookkeeping, but it was not theft, and it certainly was not a vault. To the porter's night book, he replied that Holly's peck was 71 and had been reported twice by the understeward for confusion, and that a pencil book kept by such a person could not be laid before a court. And to the 7 paces, he replied that the Office of Works had been instructed to make a visitation of the almonry Undercroft, in the interests of laying the whole unhappy business to rest. The visitation was announced on a Tuesday and made on the Friday. 3 days' notice. I was not permitted to attend. Dane was. He came to Cold Harbor that night and stood in the door of my counting shed with the rain running off him, and I knew before he opened his mouth. They had gone down at noon. The master of the household, the controller of the almonry, Lord Cassius, smiling, holding a lamp for the surveyor like a helpful nephew, and a Mr. Halbeck of the Office of Works, engaged as the Crown's expert on the fabric of the West Range. Halbeck of Halbeck Stone. Nobody in that cellar knew the name mattered except Dane, and Dane had no standing to say so, and when he tried, the master of the household told him, mildly, in front of everyone, that a captain of the guard was not an authority on masonry. They paced the undercroft, 12 bays, 25 paces, everyone agreed. Then they stood at the end wall, and Mr. Halbeck of the Office of Works put his hand on it and gave the Crown his professional opinion. The end wall, he said, was original fabric, 31 years old at the least and probably older, as any man could see from the soot on it and the settling of the mortar. The discrepancy between the interior measure and the exterior, some 7 paces, yes, quite so, was entirely accounted for by the thickness of the foundation raft at that corner, and by the old culvert of the west drain which ran the length of the range and was, he could assure their lordships, filled solid with rubble and lime in the rain before this one. There was no chamber. There could be no chamber. As to the discoloration of the cobbles in the lane lay directly above that culvert, and a culvert full of rubble will always hold a little warmth against a frost. Everyone was very reasonable. Everyone was very sorry. Lord Cassius said, quite gently, that he hoped the sergeant would be dealt with mercifully, and that a hard post like the Coalgate could do that to an older soldier. And the master of the household wrote at the foot of Dane's report, "No cause found. The matter is closed." Then the closing came down on all of us at once, and it was very tidy. Captain Ivor Dane was appointed within the week to the depot at Scary Point, a coastal fort of no consequence 8 days' journey from the capital, effective immediately. The almonry regretfully retired Mr. Holly's peck on grounds of infirmity, and his pension of 40 crowns was, by an oversight in the transfer of the roll, not paid in the following quarter, nor the one after. And I was dismissed from the service of the Crown for the removal and copying of sealed documents, which was true, and which I would do again tomorrow, and which took the Lord Steward's office 1 letter and 11 minutes to accomplish after 11 years of my life. I sold my mother's clock and moved to a room over a rope maker's in the Wharf Lane, and on the 17th day of the month of Frost, the General Court-Martial of Sergeant Corwin Rooke, Household Guard, opened in the great hall of Harrowgate, and I sat at the back of the public benches in a coat that smelled of fish and watched them take him apart in 4 hours. They did it well. There is no use pretending otherwise. The lock of the alms box was produced, and a locksmith swore it had been forced by something with a flat blade the width of a bayonet. The purse was produced, and the coins, and yes, the court heard they were of the Rel issue, and the master of the household's explanation was read out, and the court nodded, because the court was 3 officers of the household and their whole training was to believe the master of the household. Rooke's 9 pages were read into the record by the prosecutor, slowly, in a flat voice, which was the cruelest thing done in that hall all day, because read out like that, in a warm room full of gilding, in front of men in good coats, the ruts of the wagons and the frost on the cobbles and my pace, is 1.5 inches sounded like the ravings of a lonely man who had stood too long in one place. They asked him whether he had counted the pillars of the almonry undercroft. He said he had. They asked him whether it was true that he had paced the outside of the West Range at 4 in the morning on 3 occasions. He said it was. They asked him whether he considered this the ordinary conduct of a sergeant of the household guard. And he said, "No, sir. But it is the ordinary conduct of a sentry." Nobody laughed. It was the only moment in 4 hours when I felt the room lean towards him, and it lasted about as long as it takes to say it, and then the prosecutor asked him whether he had also formed the opinion that the Queen Consort of Eldermore was a thief, and the room leaned back. He was found guilty in 19 minutes. The sentence was pronounced the next morning, and this is where the whole business turns, and this is why I have written all this down, because if you take nothing else from an old woman's account, take this. The door they left open was the one they thought was decoration. In the household guard of Eldermore, there is a custom 900 years old called the sundering of the belt. When a guardsman of the king's own household is dismissed with disgrace, he is not simply sent away. He is brought into the great hall before the king himself, and the king, not an officer, not a court, the king in person with his own hands cuts the man's belt and takes back the badge he gave him. It is meant to be hated, because the point of it is that the king who honored you must be the one who unmakes you, and must look you in the face while he does it. And in the ceremony before the belt is cut, the king asks one question. It is written in the order of service. It has been asked of every disgraced man of the household for 9 centuries, and it is asked into a silence, and it is a formality, and in 90 years no man had answered it with anything but the 3 words the drill requires. Have you anything to say to your king? No, Majesty. Lord Cassius knew the custom. Everyone knew the custom. Nobody thought about it for a moment because it was not a door. It was a piece of theater at the end of a bad morning, and the king would say his line, and the man would say his line, and the belt would be cut, and they would all go to lunch. Princess Adela thought about it. She sent me one line in her own hand by a footman to a rope-maker's attic in the wharf lane, and I have it still in a frame, and it says, "He will be asked the question at the 11th hour tomorrow. Tell him the king must answer no man but himself. A**. I got it to him through the provost Sergeant Rooke had trained, who took it into the cells inside his glove and has never once, in all the years since, allowed anybody to buy him a drink for it. I saw him for 4 minutes that night through the grill. He had not slept. He had been given back his own tunic for the morning, because a man is sundered in the coat he disgraced, and it hung on a hook behind him, brushed and pressed, and he had blacked his own boots, and I do not know what to tell you about a man who blacks his boots to be broken. They answered everything, I said. My voice was not good. The coins, the book, the paces, everything. They answered everything on paper, he said. There is nothing left. There is one thing left, madam. He came close to the grill. In the dark of that cell, in the lamplight from the corridor, his face was perfectly calm and perfectly awake, and I understood that he had been standing at attention inside himself for 11 weeks and had not yet moved. They can explain a coin. They can explain a book and an old man and a clerk with a grudge and a sergeant who counts wagons. They can explain me until there is nothing left of me but a story people tell in the guardroom. He put one hand flat on the grill. They cannot explain the wall, he said. Stone does not lie about its own weight. There is a room under that floor, madam, and it is 7 paces long, and it has been there through every word of that court-martial in the dark, exactly where I said it was. All that has ever been needed is for one man with the authority to say open it * to be standing close enough to be asked. Rooke, I said, tomorrow the king is going to cut your belt. Yes, he said. And before he does, he is going to ask me a question. The great hall of Harrowgate holds 400 people, and there were perhaps 60 in it, which is worse, because 60 people in a room built for 400 makes a sound like a held breath. I got in on the public benches because the sundering is a public act. That is the point of it. And I sat at the very back with my hands in my lap and my heart going like a hammer on tin. They were all there. The king on the dais in the plain dark coat he wears for judgments, older than he looks in his portraits, with a face that gives away nothing at all. The crown prince Rowan at his right hand, young and stiff and hating every second of it. Princess Adela at his left in gray, absolutely still. The master of the household with his rod. The 3 officers of the court-martial. 2 ranks of the household guard along the walls, every one of them a man who had known Rooke for years, and not one of them able to so much as turn his head. And on the king's right, 1 step below the dais, in a chair of her own, Her Majesty the Queen Consort Morwenna, with her hands folded and her son standing at her shoulder. Lord Cassius looked, I thought, tired. It had been a long autumn for him, too. They brought Rooke in. He came down the length of that hall between two provost sergeants at the slow march, in the red tunic, immaculate, his boots black as a beetle's back, and he halted 3 paces from the dais and stood at attention. And I want to be very careful in how I put this next thing, because it is the truth, and it is the strangest thing I have ever seen. He did not look like a man being destroyed. He looked like a man on parade. The charge was read. The finding was read. The sentence was read: dismissal with disgrace, forfeiture of pension, 7 years imprisonment. The master of the household turned to the king and said the old words, that here stood a man who had broken faith with the house he was given to guard, and asked that the king take back what the king had given. And King Alaric of Eldermore stood up, and came down the 2 steps of the dais, and stopped in front of Sergeant Corwin Rooke, and asked him the question that 900 years of kings had asked into a silence. "Have you anything to say to your king?" The words were out of his mouth, and the master of the household had already lifted the knife, and the whole room had already begun, in its bones, to relax, because everybody knows the answer. "Yes, Majesty," said Rooke. "I have been in a room when a shell of glass falls off a table, and I have been in a room when a physician says a word that a family has been dreading for a month, and I tell you that the sound the great hall made at those 2 words was the same sound." The master of the household stopped with the knife in the air. One of the court-martial officers half rose. Somebody on the benches said something out loud that I did not catch. The king did not move at all. "Then say it," he said. And Rooke, who had prepared, I know now, for 11 weeks, and who had never once been permitted to speak to any man above the rank of captain, did not make a speech. "Majesty," he said, "in the spring of the flood you ordered the rel relief to be struck as a marked issue at your mint, 3 waves beneath your chin. You did that so that the crown could follow its own money into a broken country and know where it landed." He looked at the king, and the king looked back at him. "Majesty, the coin they took out of my locker is of that issue. 240 pieces of it, 300 miles from the only ground where it is lawful to spend a penny of it. It is in this palace, sealed in the provost's chest, 20 of it certified under the hand of your own master of the mint." He paused exactly long enough. "You marked that money so that you could follow it, sir. I am asking you to follow it." Behind him, Lord Cassius said, in a voice that was pitched to be reasonable and came out a half-tone too high, "Majesty, this is precisely the delusion that the court—" "Be quiet," said the king without turning round. "Majesty, be quiet." And Cassius was quiet, and the 60 people in that hall heard him be quiet, and the room changed its temperature by about 10 degrees. The king put his hands behind his back. "Sergeant," he said, "you say there is a room." "Yes, Majesty." "Where?" "Under the almonry of the consort's hand," said Rooke. "At the dark end of the undercroft, behind the end wall, 7 paces long, 3 wide, under the cobbles of the brewhouse lane. It is not on the plan of the West Range, because the plan of the West Range has been scraped and redrawn, and the paper is in the Office of Works, and any man can hold it up to a window and see it. And it is warm, Majesty, which is why the frost goes off the lane above it in a strip 3 feet wide and 7 paces long. And it is warm because there is 9 million crowns of your flood money in it, and gold sweats in the damp, and somebody down there is keeping a stove alight to save it." And into the silence after that, from the chair 1 step below the dais, the Queen Consort Morwenna said, "It is the culvert." It was not loud. She said it the way you would correct a small error of fact at a dinner table, and she said it because it was true, or because she had been told it was true, and because she had heard it said 4 times in 11 days by clever men and she believed it, and because she could not bear 1 more second of that hall's silence. The king turned around and looked at his wife. "What culvert, madam?" he said. And I watched from the very back of the great hall of Harrowgate, on a public bench, in a coat that smelled of fish. I watched a woman realize what she had said. Because the culvert was in no charge and no finding and no word of that court-martial. The culvert existed in exactly one place in the world. In Mr. Halbeck's confidential visitation report from the Office of Works, addressed to the master of the household, marked private, never read in court, never read to the accused, never published, never spoken of in that hall by any living soul. Her Majesty the Queen Consort of Eldermore had just quoted, word for word, from a secret document about a wall that she had never been told anybody suspected. Nobody in that room needed it explained. I saw the Crown Prince's head come round. I saw Adela close her eyes for 1 second, like a woman letting a wave go over her. I saw 2 of the guardsmen along the wall break their eyes front for the first time in their careers. King Alaric stood very still for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he said, "Master of the household, send for the king's masons, 12 of them with hammers and bars and a lantern." "Majesty, the Office of Works has already." 12 of them, said the king, with hammers. He turned. "Sergeant Rooke, you will show me the wall." We went down through the palace in the middle of a winter morning, 60 of us, and it must have looked like a madhouse. The King of Eldermore walking fast in his judgment coat, a prisoner in a red tunic with 2 provosts a half-step behind him and no irons on him because nobody had thought to give the order, a princess, a crown prince, 3 court-martial officers, a queen consort who had begun to say something and had been told once quietly by her husband not to. Out into the brewhouse lane. It was a hard, bright morning with the frost still on everything, on the roof of the brewhouse and on the wall of the west rain, and on the iron of the Coalgate arch at the end of the lane, except along the foot of the almonry wall. 3 feet wide, 7 paces long, bare wet cobbles, black and steaming very faintly in the cold air, and the frost lying white and perfect on every other stone in the lane, right up to the edge of it, like a tide line. The king stood and looked at that for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then he said, "Pace it, Sergeant." And Corwin Rooke went down the lane, heel to toe, in front of the King of Eldermore and everybody who mattered in the Royal House of Harrowgate, and counted the outside of the West Range aloud, in the voice he used on the drill square, and it was 34 paces. Then we went down into the undercroft, and he paced it again in the dark with the lanterns coming after him, and there were 12 bays, and it was 25. And at the end wall he stopped and turned around and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, and the King of Eldermore put out one hand and laid his palm flat against 31-year-old soot and old mortar and new lies, and held it there. "Break it," he said. The masons went at it with bars. The first thing that came away was a skin of plaster, blacked with soot and rubbed with dirt so cleverly that it had fooled a surveyor, and it came off in sheets because it was 4 months old. Behind it was brick, new brick, hard and pink and honest, laid in a good clean bond by a man who knew his trade, and the mortar in it was so young that it crumbled under a bar like sugar. And behind the brick was a door. It was an iron door in an iron frame, set into the old stone, black with age, with a wheel lock and 2 great hinges, and above it, cut into the lintel in letters 300 years old, were the words "The King's Strong Room." There was a sound in that undercroft when the lanterns found those letters. I cannot describe it. It was 60 people all doing something different, a gasp, an oath, a laugh, somebody's hand slapping the wall, and it went up into the vaulting and came back down on us like rain. It was not a secret room at all. It was the old strong room of the Kings of Eldermore, walled up and forgot and struck off the plans when the West Range was made over into a charity 31 years ago. The safest chamber ever built in this kingdom, made by dead masons for dead kings to keep the realm's silver in, and somebody had found it in an old drawing, and opened it from the coal chute, and put the realm's silver back. Lord Cassius made it 11 steps up the Undercroft stair before the provost sergeants took him. They could not find the key, so they cut the lock. It took an hour, and nobody left, and nobody spoke above a murmur, and the King of Eldermore stood the whole hour in a cellar in his judgment coat with his hands behind his back, 6 feet from the sergeant he had come there to disgrace, and neither of them said one word to the other. When the door came open, it came open slowly, and warm air came out of it into the cold cellar, and it smelled of lamp oil and iron and stone. Inside, on a plain deal table, a small stove was burning low, and beside it were a chair, a lamp, and a plate. And behind the table, from the floor to the height of a man's shoulder, stacked in courses like a wall, in the light of 20 lanterns, was the gold. There in bars, 5,911 of them, as it turned out, when it was all counted, each one stamped with a V within a circle, and a filed serial on the shoulder, each one entered in a day book in a counting house in the capital against a name that was 3 names that were one man with a scarred thumb. And down the left-hand wall, in canvas sacks with the almonry seal on the cords, 611,000 crowns of new silver, and when a mason cut one of the sacks open with his knife, it went across the flags in a bright hiss, and every coin of it had 3 little waves under the king's chin. 9,340,000 crowns. But that was not what broke them in the end, and it was not what I dream about. At the back of that room, stacked against the old stone in bundles tied with pink lawyer's ribbon, untouched, unopened, still in the wrappers they had left the chancery in 2 years before, were the papers. Relief warrants for the 11 villages of the Rel Valley, grain scrip for the winter of the flood and the winter after it, pension orders for the widows, 209 of them, each one made out in a clerk's careful hand, each one signed and sealed and lawful and worth 11 crowns a quarter to a woman living in a hayloft. Never sent, never posted, never even untied. Somebody had carried them down there and put them behind the gold, out of the way, because they took up room. Princess Adela knelt down on the flags of that cellar in a gray dress and picked up one of those bundles and held it, and she did not say anything, and she did not have to. Queen Consort Morwenna stood in the doorway of the king's strong room with the lantern light on her, and she did not weep, and she did not run, and I will give her this much. She did not pretend she did not know what was in the room. It was held in reserve, she said. The king turned his head. It was held in reserve, she said again louder, and her voice was steady and reasonable, and there was a kind of horror in how reasonable it was. 9 million crowns cannot be poured into a drowned country and left to a parish clerk and a village mayor. It would have been drunk. It would have been stolen. It would have been squandered by exactly the people who, she stopped. She gathered herself. It was to be administered properly Alaric in its time by people who understood it, and it was kept safe, and it is all here, look at it, not 1 crown of it has been spent. 240, said the king. She stopped. 240 crowns of it have been spent, madam, said King Alaric, and his voice did not rise, and it went through that cellar like a bar through plaster. They were spent to buy a purse and a lie, and to break a man of my household, so that no one would ever ask what was behind that wall. That is what it was spent on. That is the only thing your reserve has ever bought in 2 years. The ruin of the one man in this house who was doing his job. He looked around the room, at the gold, at the stove, at the ribboned bundles of pension orders for 209 widows. The widows of the Rel Valley have had nothing for 2 years, he said, and this room has had a fire in it all winter. What happened afterwards happened the way such things should happen, which is to say slowly and in courts, and with a great deal of paper. The Queen Consort was placed under the restraint of the Crown that afternoon, and removed to a house in the country with the shutters closed. Her seal was taken from her and broken on the table of the Privy Council, and the almonry of the consort's hand was dissolved by an instrument of the king the following week. No guard laid a hand on her, no soldier judged her. It went to the king's bench, where it belonged, and it took 2 years, and she sat through every day of it. Lord Cassius was tried with her, and Mr. Halbeck of Halbeck Stone, who was also Mr. Thrace of Thrace and Sons and Mr. Marrow of the Marrow Company, and who had a scar across the ball of his right thumb shaped like a fishhook, and Falk, the under-steward, who had sent an old man for his supper 36 times, and 4 partners of the House of Varon, who had melted the relief of 11 drowned villages into stamped bars for a commission of 1 crown in the 100, and had never once asked whose it was. The master of the household resigned and was not prosecuted, and I have my own opinion about that, and I will keep it. The count took 11 clerks 9 days. I was one of them. They sent for me at the rope maker's on the 2nd morning, and reinstated me by a warrant that a footman carried up 4 flights of stairs, and I sat on a mason's stool 6 feet from the king's strong room with a tally board on my knee, and counted the money that had cost me my career, and had nearly cost a good man 7 years of his life. 9,340,620 crowns. They gave Rooke his belt back in the great hall in front of the same 60 people, and the king did it himself because the custom cuts both ways. What the king unmakes, the king must mend. The conviction was quashed. The record was expunged. The 3 officers of the court-martial stood in the front rank and had to watch, and one of them, to his credit, came and spoke to Rooke afterwards, and did not make excuses. Captain Ivor Dane was recalled from Scary Point by a fast rider and promoted to major, and when he tried to say to the king that he had failed the sergeant and did not deserve it, the king said, "You were afraid, and then you came back. Most men only manage the first half." Mr. Holly's Peck's pension was restored and doubled, and paid to him by hand every quarter for the 11 years he had left, by an officer of the crown, who was required to stand while he did it. His night book, a canvas-covered corporal's kit book, written in pencil by an old man who had been taught to write things down and had never learned to stop, was bound in calf at the crown's expense and laid in a case in the public hall of the Tally House, where it is to this day, and where I have taken every single clerk I have ever trained and stood them in front of it and said, "This is what a record is for." The relief went to the Rel Valley in the spring. Not the same coin. The Rel issue was called in and melted, because a coin with that much history on it is a coin that people fight about, but the same money to the last crown, with 2 years of interest at the crown's rate on top of it, and a commission of restitution to see it spent, and Her Royal Highness the Princess Adela at the head of it, and she went down there herself in the mud, and she stayed 4 months. Ashen Ford has a bridge now. It has a mill and 40 roofs, and a stone at the crossroads with 209 names on it, not the dead of the flood, but the widows, every one of whom was paid. And the money went out through the Coalgate. That was the king's doing, and it was the only theatrical thing that severe old man did in the whole business, and I have never decided whether it was justice or vanity or both, and I no longer much care, because I was there and I have never seen anything like it. He gave the order in the cellar, standing among the sacks. "It came in through a gate," he said. "It will go out through the same one. And the man who counted it in will count it out." So for 6 days in the month of frost, the gold and the silver of the Rel Valley came up out of the king's strong room on the backs of masons and porters, and was loaded into wagons in the brewhouse lane, and driven out through the Coalgate under escort, 61 wagons in the end, over 6 days, with the axles groaning and the near horse taking the strain on the turn and the ruts cutting an inch deep in the wet lane, going the other way. And Sergeant Corwin Rooke stood his post at the arch in full ceremonial order, motionless, eyes forward, exactly as he had stood it for 6 years, and he counted every wagon out of the palace of his king. Nobody ordered the crowd to come. The lane was black with people by the 3rd day, carters, laundresses, brewers' men, half the river ward, all of them standing in the cold to watch money go past, and they were quiet mostly. And when the last wagon went under the arch on the 6th evening, somebody began to clap, and it went down that lane like a fire in dry grass. He did not turn his head. He was on duty. They offered him things afterwards, of course. A commission. He could have been an officer by the end of the year and a major by the end of the next, and an award out of the recovered fund, which the council voted him unanimously, and which was 10,000 crowns. He refused the money. He would not touch a crown of it, and when the council pressed him, he lost his temper for the only time in the entire business, in front of 2 earls, and said that the money belonged to 209 widows, and that if there were 10,000 crowns going spare, they could put a roof on the school at Ashen Ford, which they did. He turned down the commission too. He asked instead for exactly 2 things: that the man who stands the Coalgate should have the standing right in writing to weigh any wagon at his own discretion, and to be told the truth about what is in it, which is now the law of the household, and is called in the regulations the sergeant's warrant, and that he be permitted to go back to his gate. I am clerk of the tally now. There is no second window any more. There is a department and 40 clerks in it, and every account of every household of the Royal House of Harrowgate. Everyone, without exception, gift of the heart or not, comes across my desk once a year, and is read by a human being who is required to sign her name to the reading of it. It took me 9 years to build. Rooke stood the Coalgate for 11 more years. He was made warden of it in the end, a rank they invented for him, which came with no more pay and a slightly better hut, and he stood his hours in the rain and the frost like a man who had never done anything else and never wanted to. The carters took their caps off when they came through, and he told them to put them back on because it held up the traffic. I went down to see him on the day he finally handed in his rifle. It was raining, of course. It was always raining in that lane. There was a young guardsman with him, 19 or 20, being shown the post, and the boy had clearly heard the whole story 100 times in the guardroom and could not help himself, and he asked it right in front of me, the way the young do. "Sir, how did you know all that time? The whole palace said you were mad. How did you know there was 9 million crowns under that floor?" And Corwin Rooke looked out at the lane, at the wet cobbles and the arch and the ruts, with the rain coming off the peak of his cap in a clean line, and he thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything, and he gave the boy the only answer he ever gave anybody. "I didn't," he said. "I knew that candles don't weigh that much." Then he handed the boy the gate book, and told him to keep it properly, and walked out through his own arch for the last time, and the carter who was waiting there with a load of cabbages took off his cap, and nobody had to tell him to.